Picture this. It's the late 1960s or early 1970s. You're a young soldier, just back from the jungles of Vietnam. You've risked your life, answered your country's call, and now you're stepping off a plane in California, expecting a warm welcome. Instead, you're met with insults, maybe even spit. How would that feel? That's where we'll start today, because for many Vietnam veterans, coming home was as painful as the war itself. We'll also dig into how the media shaped the war's story, especially during the Tet Offensive, and why some veterans believe the war could have been won. So, grab a coffee, settle in, and let's uncover these truths together. Let's begin with one of the most gut-wrenching parts of the Vietnam War story, how America treated its returning soldiers. Over 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. More than 58,000 never came home. Another 300,000 were wounded. Those who did return, about 3 in 10 are still alive today, often faced a homecoming that was anything but heroic. Listen to this story from a veteran who landed at Travis Air Force Base in California. He's on a Continental Airlines charter jet, overjoyed to be back on U.S. soil. He's proud, maybe even wearing his uniform, thinking of the sacrifices he made. But as he walks out of the gate, a group in a hippie bus throws garbage at him. Stuff, maybe even feces. Can you imagine that? You've just survived a war, and this is your welcome. Another veteran at San Francisco International Airport says a group of people, described as filthy-looking hippie types, gathered around him yelling insults. One stepped up, just a foot away, and spat on his chest. He said it was a shock, something he never expected after serving his country. These aren't isolated stories. Another soldier at Chicago O'Hare felt like a stranger in his own country. People avoided eye contact, moved to the other side of the hallway. He went to a restaurant in the airport, and they just wouldn't serve him. No explanation, just a clear message that he wasn't welcome. One more story. A veteran boards a plane, sits next to a man who asks where he's been. When he says Vietnam, the man stops talking. Later, the veteran wakes up to find the guy moved seats just to avoid him. These stories hit hard because they show a divide in America at the time. The anti-war movement was growing, fueled by images of the war on TV and protests on college campuses. Some activists called soldiers baby killers or worse. Now, some folks today claim this mistreatment is a myth, that no one was ever spat on. But these veteran stories say otherwise. They felt betrayed, not just by the public, but by a society that seemed to turn its back on them. Joseph Galloway, a war correspondent, put it best: "They were the best you had, America, and you turned your back on them." Why did this happen? Part of it was the war's unpopularity. By the late 1960s, many Americans were questioning why we were in Vietnam. Protests were loud, passionate, and sometimes aimed at soldiers instead of policymakers. But for the veterans, who were often young men drafted into service, this felt like a personal rejection. It's a reminder of how we treat those who serve today. What can we do to make sure no one feels like a stranger when they come home?
Let's talk about a turning point in the Vietnam War, not just on the battlefield, but in the living rooms of America. The 1968 Tet Offensive was a military disaster for North Vietnam, but you'd never know it from the nightly news. According to the veterans behind this documentary, produced by the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association Foundation, the media spun a story that changed how Americans saw the war. It's a story of truth twisted into defeat. And it starts with one of the most trusted voices in journalism, Walter Cronkite. Picture January 1968. North Vietnam and their Viet Cong allies launch a massive surprise attack during the Vietnamese New Year, hitting over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. It was bold, but it backfired. The Viet Cong suffered crushing losses, about 10 times the casualties they inflicted on U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Within days, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops drove them out of nearly every target. The South Vietnamese army didn't collapse, as the attackers hoped, and the local people didn't rise up to join the Viet Cong. General Vo Nguyen Giap, a top North Vietnamese commander, later called it a devastating loss. The Viet Cong were so battered they were never again a major fighting force. On the ground, this was a clear win for the U.S. and its allies. So why did Americans think it was a defeat? Let's go to February 13, 1968. Walter Cronkite, the CBS evening news anchor known as the most trusted man in America, is in Saigon. He reports what he sees. The Tet Offensive was a military success for the U.S. and South Vietnam. The Viet Cong's plan failed, militarily, politically, and psychologically. He's spot on. But then, just 13 days later, on February 27th, Cronkite's back in New York, delivering a bombshell on national TV. He calls the war a stalemate, saying, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." This wasn't his own reporting. It was written by his producer, but it carried Cronkite's weight. Millions watched, and public opinion shifted almost overnight. President Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Soon after, he decided not to run for re-election. How did this happen? The documentary points to a bigger issue: media manipulation. North Vietnam was fighting a two-front war: military in Vietnam, propaganda in the U.S. They had help from Soviet and Communist allies, but also from within. Take Pham Xuan An, a South Vietnamese journalist working for major U.S. news outlets like Reuters and the New York Times. He was charming, trusted, and fed stories to American reporters. After the war, it came out. He was a North Vietnamese spy, later promoted to general in their army. His job? Shape the narrative to make U.S. efforts look futile. Many journalists holed up in Saigon hotels relied on locals like him for scoops. They didn't know the full story, or that their sources might be working for the enemy. This wasn't just about one spy. The media's focus on Tet's chaos, images of fighting in cities, the U.S. embassy under attack, created a sense of defeat even when the reality was different. Veterans felt this deeply. They'd fought hard, won battles, but came home to a public convinced the war was lost. The documentary quotes war correspondent Joseph Galloway. "They were the best you had, America, and you turned your back on them." That shift in perception sapped the national will to keep fighting, making every sacrifice feel heavier. What's the takeaway? The media doesn't just report, it shapes what we believe. In 1968, a military victory was sold as a stalemate, and it changed the war's course. It makes you wonder, what stories are we being told today, and who's shaping them? For the veterans, it's a wound that still stings. They fought the battles, but the narrative was out of their hands.
Now, let's tackle one of the most provocative questions about the Vietnam War. Could it have been won? For many of the 2.7 million Americans who served, the answer is a resounding yes. They don't believe they lost on the battlefield. They feel they were denied the chance to win by political decisions back home. This isn't just hindsight talking. The documentary, produced by the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association Foundation, points to specific moments and strategies that could have changed the war's outcome. Let's dive into two key examples, the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Operation Linebacker 2, and explore why veterans still carry this frustration today. First, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If you've ever seen a map of Vietnam, you'll notice Laos and Cambodia on its western border. Through Laos ran this network of jungle paths and roads used by North Vietnam to funnel troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. It was their lifeline of the war effort. As early as 1965, General William Westmoreland, who commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam, pleaded with President Lyndon Johnson to let him cut this trail. So did the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military advisors. Their plan? Send U.S. troops into Laos, a sparsely populated area, to block the trail and choke off North Vietnam's supplies. This would have shifted the war's focus from defending South Vietnam's 1,400-mile border to a 225-mile stretch in Laos. Fewer troops needed, less civilian risk, and a chance to use American firepower without the tight restrictions imposed in South Vietnam. Why didn't it happen? Johnson and his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, were scared of escalating the war. They worried China or the Soviet Union might jump in, like in the Korean War. But here's the kicker. In the 1990s, a former Soviet ambassador and a Chinese premier confirmed neither country had any plans to fight the U.S. in Vietnam. That fear was unfounded, yet it tied the military's hands. Instead, Johnson stuck to a strategy called gradual escalation, a slow drip of bombing and limited ground operations that gave North Vietnam time to build defenses. Veterans saw this as fighting with one arm tied behind their backs. Even Colonel Bui Tin, a North Vietnamese officer who accepted South Vietnam's surrender in 1975, said in a 1995 Wall Street Journal interview, "Cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail and we could not have won." That's not a U.S. veteran talking. That's the enemy admitting it. Now, let's fast forward to 1972 for our second example, Operation Linebacker 2. By this point, U.S. troop numbers were down to 24,000, mostly in support roles. President Nixon was pulling out ground forces under his Vietnamization plan, training South Vietnam to take over. But North Vietnam wasn't playing ball. They launched a massive invasion in 1972 called the Easter Offensive, thinking South Vietnam would crumble without U.S. troops. They were wrong. South Vietnamese forces held firm with U.S. air support. Nixon then unleashed Linebacker 1, a heavy bombing campaign targeting North Vietnam's military infrastructure. It hurt them bad. By October, North Vietnamese leaders admitted their invasion had failed and agreed to negotiate. But when they stalled talks, Nixon went all in with Linebacker 2 in December 1972. For 11 days, B-52 bombers pounded Hanoi and Haiphong, hitting railroads, power plants, fuel storage, and missile sites, targets that had been off-limits under Johnson's cautious approach. The damage was so crippling that North Vietnam rushed back to the table. On January 27, 1973, they signed the Paris Peace Treaty and almost all U.S. troops left South Vietnam. Veterans point to this as proof. When the U.S. used its full military might, it worked. They argued that if Johnson had greenlit this kind of bombing in 1965 or 1968 instead of the weak Operation Rolling Thunder, the war could have ended years earlier, saving thousands of the 58,000 American lives lost. So why didn't it last? Politics again. The Paris Treaty promised South Vietnam ongoing U.S. support, air power, weapons, supplies. But Congress, pressured by a growing anti-war movement, slashed funding from $2.8 billion in 1973 to just $300 million in 1975. Meanwhile, the Soviets and Chinese increased aid to North Vietnam by over 50%. When North Vietnam invaded again in 1975, South Vietnam ran out of ammo and fuel. Saigon fell on April 30th. Veterans felt betrayed, not by their own efforts, but by a Congress that they saw as abandoning an ally. One veteran in the documentary echoes President Reagan's words, "We weren't defeated, we were denied permission to win." This argument isn't without critics. Some historians say cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail would have been a logistical nightmare, or that bombing alone couldn't force a communist regime to surrender. Others argue escalation risked a wider war even if China and the Soviets stayed out. But for veterans, it's personal. They saw friends die, fought under restrictive rules, and came home to a country that seemed to give up. Their frustration isn't just about strategy. It's about feeling their sacrifices were undermined by decisions made in Washington. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that wars need clear goals and the will to see them through. Or that listening to military experts like Westmoreland or Eisenhower who warned against gradualism might save lives. For veterans, it's a call to remember their truth. The war was winnable, and they deserved a chance to prove it.
Let's cut through the fog of history. The Vietnam War wasn't lost by the 58,000 Americans who died or the millions who served. It was stolen by a spineless Congress, a complicit media, and anti-war radicals who peddled lies. Veterans came home to spit and insults because activists, fed by communist propaganda, turned heroes into villains. The media, with Cronkite as its mouthpiece, sold a victory like Tet as defeat, gutting America's resolve. And when Nixon proved we could win with Linebacker 2, Congress yanked the funding, handing South Vietnam to a communist slaughter.
3 million dead in the aftermath. That's the cost of betrayal. Wake up. The same forces, media, activists, weak leaders are rewriting truth today. Don't let them erase the veterans' story again. Comment below. Who's distorting history now? Share this and fight for the truth.